So hi everyone and welcome. We are very happy to finally have this event launching our special issue of the Journal of Holocaust Research on gender-based and sexual violence during the Holocaust. As we spoke beforehand, we realized that we started this project 3 years ago exactly with the release of the first call for paper. So this is a 3-year long project that we are very happy to see coming to fruition. With us today as panelists are multiple contributors to the special issue. Some of them written articles, others have participated in the forum articles. They will be speaking tonight. A few things to note before we begin. Just as we gather today to launch the special issue, I remain aware of the historical events and historical weight of the moment, in the influx of events that are occurring in around the world. We wanted to recall that yesterday, 2 days ago actually, was the anniversary or Yahrzeit for Kristallnacht, the November pogrom or the night of the broken glass, which marked a severe escalation in Nazi violence. I'd also like to welcome attendees from the Holocaust Education Week in Canada that is taking place this week, and that they were invited to this event, and we're happy to have them here. Before I introduce the guest editors and the contributors, I wanted to speak more generally about this issue, beginning with the cover issue that you see before you. It's been used in all our publications, and surely you've come across this before. This is a photograph of a painting by Teya Stoika. She herself was a Holocaust survivor, a Romani, Roma Holocaust survivor, who was a painter and an author. And we were given permission to use this lovely image by her international association. And if you still haven't followed through with the list of articles, I give you a full list of all the articles in this journal, in the special issue. It's a double issue. All of them are available on our website, which you could access through the emails we've sent you already before. Let me start by introducing the guest editors for this special issue. If you please open your cameras. Beginning with the guest editors, Dorota Glowacka. She's a professor of humanities at the University of King's College in Canada, author of a book with a Polish title that I won't be pronouncing, but the English translation is From the Other Side, Testimony, Affect, Imagination in 2017, and Disappearing Traces, Holocaust Testimonials, Ethics and Aesthetics in 2012. She's also the co-editor of Imaginary Neighbors, Mediating Polish-Jewish Relations After the Holocaust in 2007. Regina Mühlhäuser, she's a senior researcher at the Hamburg Foundation for the Advancement of Research and Culture in Germany, author of Sex and the Nazi Soldier, Violent, Commercial, and Consensual Encounters During the War in the Soviet Union in 2021, and co-editor of In Plain Sight, Sexual Violence in Armed Conflict in 2019. She's also the co-founder of an international research group on sexual violence in armed conflicts. Our very own Dr. Michal Aharony. She's a JHR editor, teaching fellow at the Westermann International MA program in Holocaust Studies at the University of Haifa. She earned her PhD in political science from the New School for Social Research and was the author of Hannah Arendt and the Limits of Total Domination, the Holocaust, Plurality, and Resistance, and the article Freddie Hirsch, Changing Perspectives of His Memory in 2021. Thank you for all the efforts, 3-year-long efforts on this special issue.
Yeah, thank you, Yoav, and of course also Michal, not only for the kind introduction, but also for all the collaboration and the long, as you mentioned, long process in putting this together with has been really inspiring and valuable. And yeah, I think we can talk a lot about it, but it has been a very good process, I think, on a complicated subject. And as you already mentioned, this has been 3 years in the making, and we began to plan it actually in the fall of 2021. And at that time, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine was still several months away. And it was also another 2 years before Hamas attacked on Israel on 7th October 2023. And so it was also 2 years before the beginning of Israel's war in Gaza. So at that time, none of us knew that soon gender-based and sexual violence would become a highly visible and contested, politically contested subject in the way that it became in the past years. Nor did we anticipate that statements about World War II and the Holocaust, and in particular about sexual violence during the Holocaust, that such statements would be invoked to make claims about the present, often drawing on simplistic assumptions and without regard to the historical facts. So the instrumentalization of gendered and sexual violence to convey interest-specific narratives of war and genocide is actually not a new phenomenon. So we can find it regularly that depictions of sexual violence are used to contrast and to reinforce warring factions as political dichotomies, so to speak. So us versus them, good versus evil, civilized versus uncivilized. And this largely depends on political and social perceptions of a given conflict. So which constellations of perpetrators and victims are made visible and which disappear from view, whose narratives are amplified and whose voices are silenced. So this largely depends on the political and social perceptions of a given conflict. So the actual victims largely vanish in these dominant framings, and so do the real perpetrators. So what is more, the situational dynamics of the actual physical acts of what is actually happening, who does what to whom, this is also obscured. And we don't ask anymore about the ways in which gender norms, groups' perceptions, power relations, bodily and psychological reactions are intertwined. So this also means that experiences that deviate from the main narrative become difficult to articulate. So, for example, in-group sexual violence or various forms of sexual barter or transactional sex, all of these constellations become difficult to articulate. And even when survivors are asked about their experiences, for example, by journalists or researchers, or when they are questioned during military or police investigations or during tribunals, they often feel that they must follow a certain socially sanctioned script about their experience. So as a consequence, the experiences of victims are often reduced to politically legible patterns in the past and today. And the reality of sexual violence and the profound individual, societal, and political consequences are ignored, obscured, and often intentionally misrepresented. Also, certain events and the meanings of specific incidents might be publicly debated at a certain point in time, only to later disappear again from public consciousness.
Yes, thank you, Regina. Let me add that similar patterns of visibility and erasure of the reality of sexual violence are common in the study of the Holocaust. For instance, until relatively recently, it was assumed that talking about sexual violence in the Holocaust is taboo. But if we look closer, historical evidence definitely tells us otherwise. And when World War II and the Holocaust were still ongoing, cases of rape and sexual torture by German soldiers, the collaborators were collected. They were published to draw attention to the crimes against Jews, but also to appeal for militarist support. And perhaps the best known example is the Black Book of Polish Jewry. It was published in the United States in 1943 by a group of exiled Polish Jews. And it contained many eyewitness accounts describing Nazi crimes, including sexual torture, rape, and sexual enslavement. And the editors of the Black Book relied on familiar patterns of accounts of sexual violence and depictions of brutalized female bodies. They knew that such narratives, such accounts were effective in gaining social, political, also military support. So such accounts powerfully symbolize the fear of intruders, the threat of communities' disintegration, the destruction of social order. And the cases of sexual violence that were described in the Black Book mostly focused on scenarios where the victims were very young or where sexual violence was accompanied by excessive cruelty, because the editors wanted to create this sense of urgency and to dispel doubts about the necessity of intervention. So it was a persuasive tactic and perhaps understandable when the genocide was unfolding, but it also came at a cost, because ultimately these representations made the reality of sexual violence even less visible. They also obscured the various forms of harm suffered by the victims. Moreover, they shaped the spaces in which survivors could then tell the stories, and imposing these regimes of unspeakability and silence. So the victims were also prevented from articulating the experiences of sexual harm by the narratives of female sexual shame, and that narrative holds women and girls responsible for protecting the chastity. So immediately after the war, many survivors felt the need to deal with the trauma, to process their experiences, and some made disclosures about sexual violence, even though those mentions were very brief and matter of fact. Yet these initial opportunities were quickly foreclosed in the mid-1950s, and that was partly because survivors felt stigmatized and shamed. But then on the other hand, we also saw pervasive sexualization of representations of Nazi violence against women in various popular cultural productions. The depictions of Nazi sexual exploitation of helpless female victims vilified the perpetrators as the epitome of barbarism, inhuman, immoral, and degenerate. And these were simplifications that provided the post-war audiences with the reassurance of their own decency and morality.
So when we speak today about the notion of rape as an instrument of terror or a tool of war, this actually began to enter the vocabulary in the 1960s and 70s. So during the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, and the peace movement. So these developments then also informed the proceedings, for example, of the conference Women Surviving the Holocaust that was organized in 1983 by Joan Ringelheim and Esther Katz. So at that conference, several survivors did mention incidents of sexual violence, even though only in passing and without providing much detail. However, it was not until the mid-1990s, following the war and genocide in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda and its neighboring states, it was not until then that feminist political interventions and research on sexual violence in conflict zones began to expand. Ever since, however, there have been many debates and controversies about the phenomenon of what we call today CRSV, sexual violence, conflict-related sexual violence. So despite this increased knowledge, understanding accounts of sexual violence during the Holocaust continues to pose specific challenges. On the one hand, researchers still struggle to identify and to interpret the gaps in historical records and to decipher the hints that are veiled in social taboos. On the other hand, they try to unpack the complexity of allegedly straightforward narratives or to pass out the hidden layers of narrative embellishments. All of this sheds light on the dangers of reducing sexual violence during the Holocaust to simplified interpretations, to a simplified framework. So as the articles in this special issue show, sexual violence was indeed perpetrated by a range of different actors. So German soldiers, SS men, German civilians, their collaborators in different countries, but also resistance fighters, rescuers, members of persecuted groups, and also liberation soldiers. Some of the acts of sexual violence were directed against members of the enemy, but others were committed against members of one's own group or against individuals who were under one's protection. And while most of the victims were women and girls of different ethnic groups, of different nationalities and different religious affiliations, various forms of sexual violence were also perpetrated against boys and men. Recent research has also shown that sexual violence was also perpetrated against gender non-binary persons. So whether certain acts were understood as sexual violence also depended on specific ideas about gendered bodies. In the concentration and extermination camps, for example, all prisoners were forced to undress, but the significance of forced nudity was different. Forcing a woman to take off her shirt was usually perceived as sexual or sexualized, while forcing a man to do the same was not.
Thank you. And in a word, during the Holocaust, sexual violence was simply ubiquitous. And the contributors to this special issue discuss it within a very broad spectrum of agency and vulnerability. They probe how the knowledge about sexual violence was received in the decades after the war in distinct cultural contexts. They explore the factors that shape the diverse and sometimes contradictory interpretations. They show that if studying this subject is crucial, it requires that we address very complicated methodological, ethical, and political questions, but also scrutinize our own ideological investments and ways of knowing. And we opened this special issue with what we call a forum, a conversation among 6 scholars. And I wonder if we can have a slide with the forum contributors. Thank you. On the slide, we could only fit in the highlights of their achievements. The contributors are Kenny Fries, who is memoirist, poet, and disability activist, Atina Grossmann, professor of history at the Cooper Union, Anna Haikova, co-director of the Center for Global Jewish Studies at Warwick, Björn Krondorfer, director of the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University, Joanna Ostrowska, a historian, film critic, and dramaturgist, and Zoe Waxman, who is professor of Holocaust studies at Oxford University. And we are delighted that most of them are here with us today. Unfortunately, Anna Haikova and Joanna Ostrowska were not able to join us, but they are here with us in spirit. And in the forum, they all take the pulse of the current state of debates about gender, sexuality, and sexual violence during the Holocaust. They reflect on the different conditions in which they have conducted the work, and they talk about the ideas and scholarly currents that have helped them develop their specific forms of understanding. They also think about the challenges and obstacles that they have faced at various stages of the work. And they show how deep-seated assumptions about gender and sexuality influence and sometimes hinder research. And besides the forum, the special issue contains 8 articles, and 2 of which by Will Jones and Justyna Matkowska will be presented momentarily. But perhaps before we get to those essays, I'm going to give you a snapshot of the remaining articles, if that's okay, Joav, so we can have the other slide. The other contributors to the issue, and again, I can only briefly introduce them. Pascale Bose, barter prostitution abuse, reframing experiences of sexual exchange during the Holocaust. And in that essay, Bose examines the descriptions of sexual exchanges in the accounts by two female survivors, Olga Lengio's Five Chimneys and Molly Applebaum's Buried Words, in the context of North American scholarly debates. And she shows that when analyzing these accounts, scholars impose their own moral and political frameworks, which are determined by the historical moment and its particular concerns. And that often comes at the expense of a more nuanced understanding of the situational conditions and of the recognition of the victim's agency. Next, we have Christine Zulke, who is postdoctoral research fellow in Holocaust literature at Washington University in St. Louis. And in her paper, Zulke analyzes an excerpt from the secret diary of the Auschwitz Sonderkommando prisoner Leib Langfuss, and focusing on the interactions between the male Sonderkommando prisoners and the female prisoners who were just about to be gassed. Zulke argues that even in that extreme situation, the reactions were complex and they were also shaped by gendered perceptions.
So, as we already mentioned before, what was largely silenced after the end of the war was the fact that sexual violence was not only perpetrated by soldiers of the aggressor forces, but also by the liberating armies. So Allied accounts of the liberation of survivors of Nazi camps and death marches at the end of World War II emphasized the long-awaited release of prisoners from captivity and the threat of extermination. And as Diana Eglaitis shows, however, the voices of women whose victimization did not end with the arrival of their liberators were missing from these accounts. To fill out what she calls a memory void, Eglaitis analyzes the testimonies and memoirs of Jewish survivors who describe sexual violence perpetrated against them by Soviet liberating soldiers. So, while relatively little work has been done on this constellation in which the perpetrators were Allied soldiers, research on sexual violence by Wehrmacht and SS perpetrators has become more detailed in recent years. So currently new questions are being asked about why sexual violence seemed to be such a readily available for ordinary German men, and how situational dynamics unfolded. So in his article, Ed Westermann argues that the basis for this violence was built by allegedly harmless forms of gender and sexual humiliation, for example, vulgar comments or sexualized jokes. These created, he argues, a context in which additional acts of sexual violence and sexual assault would become normalized. What is more, the perpetrators often used the tool of photography to capture their victims' sexual humiliation and exploitation. So in the final article of this special issue, Elissa Mailänder calls the photos that some of the Wehrmacht soldiers took trophy pictures. So drawing on images taken in different European World War II contexts, Mailänder examines the way in which German soldiers visually and physically conquered and photographically appropriated local women and girls. So in her view, these images reveal the troubling conjunction of aesthetics, violence, power, desire, and sexual pleasure. So she says they allow a glimpse into cultural and affective configurations that shape the dynamics of conquest.
So as you can see, taken together, these articles it encompass a very broad but by no means exhaustive range of phenomena that are now recognized as various forms of gender-based and sexual violence. And the authors insist on the intricacy, ambiguity, and plurality of experiences that fall under the rubric. And they all require rigorous scrutiny, multivalent approaches, innovative interpretive frameworks. So we hope that engaging publicly with these difficult histories, acknowledging their complexity, will increase awareness of the complicated dynamics of gender-based and sexual violence in conflict zones, but also while averting the dangers of simplification, of instrumentalization that render the actual experiences of historical actors often unrecognizable. Thank you. And I think we
Thank
will
you.
now move. Yes.
Yes. Sorry, I had a hard time unmuting myself. Yes. In addition to these 5 articles and the forum that had been mentioned before, we chose, in fact, 3 speakers to present their research today. Unfortunately, Carli Snyder, who was supposed to present today, is unable to attend, and therefore I'll be introducing her along with the 2 other speakers that are indeed here. We'll start with William Ross Jones. William is a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford, non-residential scholar at USC Shoah Foundation. He had his thesis. They had a thesis examining sexualized violence experienced by men and boys during the Holocaust. He also translated Anna Haikova's book mentioned on Geschichte sind Staub, Homophobie und Holocaust. People Without History Are Dust, Homophobia and the Holocaust, which is forthcoming. And in this special issue, they were the author of You Are Going to Be My Bettmann, Exploitative Sexual Relationships and the Lives of the Peoples in Nazi Concentration Camps. Now, Will, if you'll excuse me, I'll introduce Justyna as well, and Carli. Justyna Matkowska earned her PhD from the University of Wrocław and Pedagogical University of Krakow. She's a postdoctoral researcher at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, studying alienation and othering of Roma and Muslims in Europe. She's an expert researcher for rethinking Roma resistance at the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture. Her contribution in this special issue was an article entitled Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Against Romani Women and Girls in Occupied Poland During World War II. And lastly, Carli Snyder, who is not here with us today. She's a PhD candidate in history at the City University of New York Graduate Center. For this special issue, she contributed the article entitled Asking About the Unspeakable, Joan, Ringelheim, and Early Research on Holocaust Violence and Same-Sex Practices Among Women During the Holocaust. Without further ado, I will stop my screen share and I will invite William to present his work. William, you have permissions to share a presentation if you'd like.
Thank you very much.
Unmute yourself.
I don't have a presentation to share with you today. I often don't use them unless I have very long quotes to go over. Just quickly, hello everyone. Thank you so much for introducing me, and thank you so much for allowing me to be here to speak today. A quick bio update. A lot has changed since 3 years ago when this was all submitted. I recently defended and passed my PhD at the University of Oxford, and I am now a teaching fellow at the University of Warwick. So that is the update. And I will be at Lessons and Legacies next week. So hopefully I will be seeing some of you there. And I see Zoe has turned her camera on. Hi, Zoe. So before we get started, I just wanted to offer a short content warning. I mean, obviously, we all know why we're here, but my paper includes graphic descriptions of sexual violence, so please feel free to meet me if you need at all. So just to give you a little background, when I first came to the subject of sexual violence against men and boys during the Holocaust in 2019, while on a Master of Studies at the University of Oxford, there was only one English article about sexual violence against men and boys, and that was Robert Summers' chapter on the People And this is where my work began and built off from in a master's dissertation and then my PhD thesis. So my wider thesis and my forthcoming monograph answer the questions: what forms of sexual or sexualized violence did men experience in the camps? Who were the victims and who were the perpetrators? How do these forms of violence connect into the wider genocide, if at all? i.e., can we understand sexualized violence against men and boys as genocidal strategies or as genocidal outcomes? And it's also at all times an investigation of testimony and memory. So looking at how men talk about and remember their past experiences of sexual violence and their gendered body. But it begins by examining the Pipels, and the article largely stems from my first and second chapters, which were developed from a clear need for a more detailed study of these boys' lives when I first came to the subject. So this began with an interrogation of how the relationships formed and operated. Exploitative sexual relationships typically formed following a similar pattern. Shortly after arriving in a new camp or a barrack, a boy was chosen by an older prisoner and shown some sort of favor. For some, these privileges were from the beginning exchanged for non-sexual services like cleaning the barrack, food preparation, and clothes washing, only turning sexual with time. For others, they were initially given completely freely to the would-be victim to build a relationship with and access to the victim.
Wow,
Through
the speakers
this
are working.
sorry, I didn't hear you, Pascale, if you were adding something. Through this interaction, a connection between a potential victim and an abuser was cemented as the potential victim watched other prisoners without such privileges quickly deteriorate and die. It was only after this trade or gift dynamic was established that the sexual nature of these relationships would be revealed through forced sexual contact or rape. And from this moment, the dynamic of the relationship changed. For survivor Kenneth Roman, he states, quote, "I realized the benefits right away, not having to work hard, having that extra bit of food. I mean, the significance of it, there's no price. You can't put a price on it," end quote. Sex became an expected and accepted component of the established survival connection, although it was not initially consensually agreed upon. The creation of such a dynamic was often the end of the similarities, as the day-to-day life and the power dynamics operating within could be and were vastly different. Peoples are typically understood as those boys serving in visible, semi-official positions in the camp hierarchy under a male functionary in whose block they lived. It was these boys that typically received a label, although it could differ. Bettmann, Kalefaktor, Putzer, Läufer, Pupenjunge, Ponymaiman, the list goes on. Tasks and relative freedom therein were different depending on one's prisoner abuser, who could be a man or a woman, could be a functionary or non-functionary prisoner. Some occupied no official role at all, and these boys who served non-functionary prisoners or who were kept in secret didn't occupy positions of privilege beyond receiving an extra bit of food, sometimes not even that. They were not removed from their labor assignments, and without the visible proximity to their more privileged abusers within the hierarchy, they couldn't capitalize on any relative power or protection that proximity often bought other survivors, or other victims, excuse me. Through defining these relationships more clearly, what was happening, the traits that made one more or less vulnerable to this form of sexual violence, in other words, more or less rapeable, became apparent. Youth, size, and Jewishness all compounded in this intense prisoner power hierarchy, making small Jewish children the most easily exploited in the system designed to ensure Jewish death, although they weren't the only victims. All the while, victims' voices were resounding in their experiences being ones of sexual assault and rape. The fact that many of these boys and adolescents were under the age of 18 at the time of their assault further urged me to reconsider how we classify this type of relationship. Often seen as a constrained form of consensual sex, aka sexual barter, the violent enactment of rape from the first instance of assault and the tie between the abuser and their life-giving privileges colored this phenomenon as one of non-consensual sexual servitude. Indeed, as the article shows, the survivors recall it as such. Returning to Kenneth Roman, who describes the night the sexual nature of his job as a Bettmann, or a bedboy, or bedman, literally, but became known to him. He says that the block officer says to him, quote, "Strip and go into my bed. Saying no, he'll kill me there and then. Look, I mean, you had no choice. So then, he there and then, I mean, he raped me." Despite accepting his situation and attempting to satisfy his abuser sexually as best he could, Roman consistently highlights the helplessness in which he was in no position to either refuse or defend himself, experiencing the sexual nature of his relationship explicitly as rape. Nevertheless, the ability to accept these relationships, sometimes finding comfort in them, allowed for a level of agency altogether different from that in sexual slavery, such as in the brothels. The diverse range of experiences these boys and adolescents had, and the particularity of the dynamic, I believe, calls for a new language, exploitative sexual relationships, which follows the UN definition of relationship in which there is any actual or attempted abuse of position, of vulnerability, differential power, or trust for sexual purposes. What's particularly useful about such a terminology is that it's not exclusive to boys officially known as Pipels. As I have briefly covered here, there were many victims of exploitative sexual relationships in the camps who did not have a label, who had a label other than Pipel, whose roles were less clearly defined. And there were those who acted as people who did not necessarily fulfill sexual services at all. Moreover, such a terminology references the exploitative power manipulation that was essential to gaining and maintaining one of these boys as a sexual servant. I also believe this terminology can and should be applied elsewhere in certain cases of women's experiences of sexual violence during the Holocaust, but also similar experiences of exploitative and continuous sexual violence found in other settings. In any case, by exploring the lives of the Pipel and other victims of exploitative sexual relationships, making more visible their lived experiences and the unique nature of violence they face, other forms of violence that did not fit this pattern can be brought into contrast, ones that have either not previously been considered as sexual or sexualized violence for men and boys, or forms that have been subsumed by the narrative of the Pipel. Historians can increasingly turn their eyes toward the much wider sexual vulnerability of men during the Holocaust. Both within the camps and without, Jewish males' position at the bottom of the societal hierarchy and the Nazi goal to eradicate all Jews everywhere made Jewish men, as well as Jewish women, vulnerable to sexual violence at nearly every turn. Although this violence may not have been common, it was widespread, and it must be understood as it has important implications for our understandings of the Holocaust and violence and genocide more generally. For more, you can both read the article, see my thesis, or see my forthcoming monograph. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank
Will.
you, Will.
I just want to remind the attendees that we are open to questions using the QA tool at the bottom. If this is a question relating to Will or to the next presenter, or if in later stages in our discussion, if you would like to pose a question, we are reading and monitoring the QA section. I'd like to invite Justyna Matkowska, who I presented before. Justyna, are you with us? There you are. If you could just open your camera, please.
Oh, okay.
There you are. Thank you.
And I'll just make the presentation. Oh, sorry, I have all the Zoom and okay. So hello, welcome. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm truly honored and pleased to be here. I would like to thank editors and editorial team for their great work. And in my presentation, I will discuss the topic of sexual and gender-based violence against Romani women and girls in occupied Poland during World War II. In case of my the introduction you gave, I also have some updates. I completed my postdoc, and on November 1st, I started my hybrid research fellowship at a Mandel Center at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I would like to start with sharing how I started this research. I actually work on different projects. I work on project on Romani resistance in Auschwitz-Birkenau as part of my fellowship at the Mandel Center at USHMM. And as I analyzed the testimonies, I encountered stories of rape of Romani women. And I found it very interesting that as Romani woman and as a scholar, I had never heard about the tragic experience of Roma women, and I decided to write about that. And this work represents some of the most challenging research I have done in my career. The emotional weight of this project was heavy as I delved into testimonies. And this work brought many tears and sleepless nights, but I knew that it's extremely important to bring that to light. Presenting these traumatic experiences of Romani women and girls is purely for research purpose and with no intent to offend any Romani family. As granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, I seek to pay homage to all women who are victims of sexual assault or rape during World War II. Before I start, I would like to also share why the topic of Romani genocide is so important to me. I'm a scholar of Romani background and third-generation Holocaust survivor. My great-grandfather and most of his family members were murdered in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Nazi also murdered my second great-grandfather in the forest during anti-Roma pogrom. My great-grandmothers survived as they were in forced labor. And this is a picture of my grandmother on the right, and here are the women from my family, all Holocaust survivors with children. And so that's the reason I'm committed to educating others about the Holocaust. For my research, I adopted Dahl's definition of a victim as a person suffering for reason unrelated to her own agency. And I would like to very briefly emphasize that Roma and Sinti, similarly to Jews, face persecution in the ghettos, concentration camps, extermination camps, and mass executions throughout the Nazi-occupied territories. And accurate data on Romani population and the scale of genocide is scarce, and it's very challenging to understand the extent of this crime. However, it's estimated that approximately 500,000 Roma and Sinti fell victims to the Nazis, but some experts like Donald Kenrick regards this figure as symbolic rather than precise. For decades after the end of World War II, Nazi genocide of Romani people, often referred as Samudaripen, and this is a Romani term for the Holocaust, and also forgotten genocide, remain at the margins of the Holocaust discourse. And the fate of Romani women and girls, particularly their experiences of violence, has been ignored, not only by community, but also by scholars who failed in this research. The most in-depth research has been conducted by Michal Aharony, who focused on sexual violence against Roma women and girls in Romanian context. Other articles just merely mention this form of violence without more detailed analysis. And Romani women found themselves in especially difficult situation due to both Nazi persecution as well as long-standing history of exotization and sexualization of Romani women in Europe dating back to 18th century. Who didn't hear about Carmen or Esmeralda? They're both Romani characters and very much rooted in the arts and culture. Addressing another problem is that sexual violence is considered culturally forbidden within traditional Romani communities, as it can result in consequences for the victim, particularly because it involves a man who is not a husband of a woman, and rape is an act which is considered extremely shameful, not only for the victim, but for her own family. And for this, because of that, talking about the rape or sexual assault was forbidden, and women were not allowed to talk about it. My study focuses on sexual and gender-based violence against Romani women and girls in the part of Poland that was first occupied by Soviet Union, then by the Nazi Germans, and then again by the Soviet Union. I analyzed total of 181 Polish language testimonies of Romani survivors and witnesses of genocide collected by USC Schach Foundation Visual History Archive and conducted by the male interviewer named Stanisław Laskowski. And 23 of them directly or indirectly are referring to sexual and gender-based violence against Romani women and girls during World War II. These testimonies describe 29 cases of rape and attempted rape, and also gender-based violence. 13 of them represent cases of rapes by Soviet soldiers. 6 represents cases of sexual abuse by Ukrainian nationalists, and 10 represented attempted rapes and gender-based violence by Nazi Germans. And while the cases of sexual and gender-based violence committed by Germans and Ukrainian men occur at the beginning of the war, Soviet rapes and threat of rapes happened towards the end of the World War II or during or immediately after the liberation. The analyzed testimonies give the impression that the most brutal forms of sexual and gender-based violence towards Romani women were committed by the Ukrainian nationalists. And I would like to share with you some of the fragments of testimonies. This is a testimony of woman whose sister was raped by the German soldiers. And I will quote, "We only hid there in the countryside. They were coming, raping there. And later at night, they came and raped Romani women. They raped my sister, and they also raped someone who was pregnant. And so my mother always hid us because we were the youngest, so that they wouldn't rape us." Another testimony talks about the atrocities committed by Ukrainian nationalists. And this woman lost her mother, and I remember this testimony very well because it was really emotional testimony. So this woman said, "My mother went to the countryside and my sister went there too, along with my aunts, and they were killed, murdered. There were 12 people killed. Sir, they cut off their tongues, pardon my language, they cut off their breasts. They did such tortures. They raped my 2 sisters. They were just girls." Another testimony also talking about the Ukrainian nationalists says, "They attacked us at night. We were in the tents and it was raining quite heavily. And then we were looking for gold. And then they were looking for gold, whether the gypsies were rich. When they did not find anything, they gave up. They took one gypsy girl, they raped her, a young gypsy girl, they hurt her." Another testimony says, "Mommy went to open the door, and when the Ukrainian grabbed that handle, the one used for grinding, he took it and wrested it from our hands. My God, as many stairs as they were, that's how many lashes Mom and I received on our backs. He didn't beat me but on the shins, and beat my mother on her arms, her back, her legs, to the points where my mother was bleeding. I couldn't walk on my legs for several days, but my mom somehow did." Another very short statement was made by Romani woman, and that was testimony talking about the rapes by Soviet soldiers. She said, "Before our eyes, one Romani woman was raped and murdered. When we saw that the Soviets were approaching, women, were running into the forest. All these women all ran away into the forest. They ran into the forest because they were afraid. I don't remember anymore. These women these were also so unpleasant. Why some were polite, others were seeking alcohol, and then the woman whispered, raped women. We were also afraid. We were terribly afraid. So the testimony speaks for themselves. They describe tragic experiences of Romani women by the groups of 3 perpetrators. And survivors provide the places of the events, but out of 23 testimonies, only 1 testimony gives exact date of the event. And most probably is due to the fact that interviews with Romani survivors were conducted only in 1997 and 1998, more than 5 decades after the end of World War II, making it very challenging for the survivors to recall the details of their wartime experiences. Additionally, the passing of time claimed already lives of many Holocaust survivors, and it was underscoring the importance of documenting these testimonies to preserve the memory of their suffering and resilience. Sexual and gender-based violence against Romani women and girls can be closely linked to the process of dehumanization and genocidal violence. This period saw a rise in the dehumanization of Roma, similarly to earlier years marked by anti-Roma legislations, systemic discrimination, prejudice, and racism. Romani women found themselves subject to a double dehumanization, not only at the hands of Nazi Germans and Ukrainians, but also Soviet soldiers. This dual discrimination manifested in 2 significant ways. First, Romani women were treated as subhumans. And second, sexual violence against women, including rape, was tragically perceived as spoils of war or even war trophies. Many Romani women chose not to disclose their traumatic experiences, and it was due to a combination of internal Romani cultural taboos, feeling of shame, and humiliation. As a result, most narratives regarding the sexual abuse of Romani women came from the accounts provided by other Romani individuals rather than directly from the victims. Only women who managed to escape the rape spoke openly about their experiences. In 2 cases of elderly Romani women, the rape stories was disclosed by their family members sitting next to them during the interview. Perhaps due to trauma, these women did not remember those experiences or did not want to talk about them. But it's also possible that they did not want to tell their stories to a male interviewer who, in addition to being man, was also non-Roma person. After the end of war and until now, Romani women were left alone with their trauma and could not talk about these horrible experiences with members of Romani community. In addition, Romani people were and still are the most stigmatized, socially excluded, and discriminated against minority in Europe. All these factors contributed to alienation of Romani women and girls who were left coping without any internal and external hope. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Will and Justyna. These were such powerful presentations, and thank you for your important contributions to the issue. It's a little difficult for me to compose myself after hearing these presentations. Let us move on, however, and we have about 20 minutes.
We have 2 questions coming from the chat, if you don't mind me to Will. And if there are any other questions, I invite you to send them. So Will, is your camera open? Someone, anonymous attendee, is asking, what is the source of the term people?
Yeah, so I'll give you a short answer, and then I'm going to tell you where to go to find the long answer. So there's a couple of different possible sources of the word. typically understood to be a diminutive form of the Yiddish word pupa, meaning a small boy. But Hannah Pullen-Galley has just written extensively on the source of this word. If you go to chapter 7 of her new book, Occupied Words, What the Holocaust Did to Yiddish, it just came out. She's got a whole big section in one of her chapters on the word people, and it's a good place to go for the answer to that question. Yeah.
I believe she's also here with us, Hannah, and the audience. So, oh, sorry, another question. Another question coming from Cole. I'm very interested in your topic. I have a quick question. Did any victims you encountered in your research of these exploitative sexual relationships end up encountering the perpetrator of the relationship following their liberation?
So I know of one survivor specifically who did come across his abuser after the actually later in the camp. So not technically after the war. No one that I've come across saw them after the war, but this survivor did find him in a different camp later on in the war, and he actually says that he killed him, that he got some help with some other prisoners and he killed the man for what he did to him. And he's very unapologetic of the fact that he did it as well. So that's the only one that comes to mind. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have about perhaps 20 minutes left, and we've already heard for two of our contributors. And let me remind you, we have here with us Kenny Fries, Atina Grossmann, Björn Krondorfer, Zoe Waxman, the contributors to the forum, as well as Pascale Bose, Kristin Zulke, and Edward Westermann, the other contributors. Unfortunately, Dana Iglitis had to leave us in the meantime. So what I'd like to do is to pose a very general question and invite those other contributors to answer it in whichever way they wish. Briefly, maybe 2 minutes or so, if I may, ask you to do the impossible. And the question, umbrella question, how has the understanding of gender-based and sexual violence in the Holocaust changed over time, and why? Which issues remain unacknowledged and, in your view, are most pressing to inquire into today? And if you could maybe raise your virtual hand, and I will try to monitor it and call on you in order. I'm turning it over to you.
I also encourage you to open your cameras for everybody to see.
And I would also like to say that, of course, in the audience, if you still have questions to the two presenters that you have just heard, you can still pose them even during the discussion in the chat, and we will read them at the end or get back to them at the end.
Or any other questions for that matter. Ed, please, could you unmute yourself?
Yes, well, thank you to Justyna. Thank you all to Will and to the editors. I really found it a fascinating volume and a great experience to be part of this. I would just like to briefly emphasize something that Dorota talked about. The Jewish Black Book was published in 1946. And it is full of these types of stories, which I think is important. We can also think about Vasily Grossmann and Ilya Ehrenberg, who also documented this. So I think one of the questions we have to ask is, why were those sources ignored the way they were? Is that part of the Cold War ideology? But I think that that's an important question because the evidence was there early. The other thing that I would briefly mention is I do think that from my own research, the question of how gender can be looked at to discuss perpetrator motivation is an extremely important part of this discussion. The way in which the perpetrators themselves use their gender conceptions and how they influence the actions, both physical abuse and sexual violence, is key. And finally, the idea of public sexual violence, actually, which is something we haven't discussed, but the fact that many of these acts were not necessarily committed in places, private places, in barracks or places away from individuals, but that they were group activities, communal group activities. In some cases, survivors talking about how they were in public spaces where people could see them. And certainly the Minsk pogrom is a perfect example of that. And my question for the future would be, what were the after effects? What can we try to find out about how those who experience this, as Justyna kind of talked about and as Will talked about, how did they transition after these events, and what were the long-term effects? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed. Do we have anyone else jumping in? Kind of looking around.
Sure, I
Oh,
can.
Pascale,
Yeah.
go ahead. Thank you.
I think my general sense, and this article, so my article sort of discusses this, is that initially, certainly there was considerable mention of sexual violence, both by male and female survivors. And in this case, I'm talking about Jewish survivors. And this is something that became kind of improper to discuss in light of sort of the general post-war normalization, both in Europe and the US. And those stories kind of became snowed under. And then it's sort of, interestingly enough, they are picked up in more sensationalized ways, sort of later in the 1950s and then throughout the 60s. And then the sensationalizing of these kinds of stories really shuts down an actual discussion of sexual violence that historically happened. And then ultimately, I think it's really to the credit of early feminist scholars, Joan Ringelheim, obviously prominent among them, to draw attention again to this kind of violence and to ask survivors about it, and encourage them to talk about it, and not just in the particular constellation that most people assumed this violence took place, which is, you know, Nazi men, Jewish women, maybe in the context of enforced prostitution, sexual slavery, and so forth, which turns out not to have been the way in which this particular violence took place, but really in a broader context. Indeed, Jewish women raped by liberation soldiers, Jewish women experiencing sexual violence in the context of their hiding among partisans, within the ghettos by the in-group. So, for example, also sexual violence by other Jewish inmates. And of course, over time, that has also allowed stories of same-sex sexual violence to emerge. But as I'm sort of the argument I make in my piece is that the things that are sort of complex to discuss at this point are these situations in which what we nowadays consider in very black and white terms sexual violence, where perhaps the lines are more blurred. So in the piece in which I write about barter, exchange sex, and so forth, it's very clear that we still have a lot of work to do to conceive of these kinds of stories in non-judgmental ways, and in ways that resurface what the survivors themselves said about it. And at this time, of course, I'm speaking in past tense because so few survivors are still alive, but we have an enormous wealth of interviews and also memoirs to look at, and it behooves us to look at them again, because it turns out we have often misread or misinterpreted what was there to be seen and heard. And of course, crucially, we need to go look much more indeed at all these gender aspects, both as was pointed out, gendered aspects of perpetration, and certainly also a much broader variety of victims, and certainly also men as victims. But it's happening, and it's exciting that it is happening, even though it's much belated.
Thank you so much, Pascale. And I think we have Atina. Atina, please. Thank you.
Yes, yes. I have to lower my, well, I'll worry about lowering my
No,
ass.
no worries.
Yeah, maybe just to follow up on, on Pascale's really excellent points about the complexity and the variety of experiences and how we understand them now and how they were understood then and what can be spoken now when actually the living voices are gone and how it was understood then. That I was just, when I was rereading the forum, I noticed that the first question was, well, how did we come to this topic? And we can't, it may be worth sort of mentioning that we came to it very differently at different times, having to do also with age and location, and that there are multiple paths to thinking about sexual violence. That, so just in my case, sort of coming out of coming out of second wave feminism and being interested in questions having to do with reproductive rights and reproductive justice, and sort of moving from there, but thinking about Nazi population policy to very accidentally first actually discovering something that was not about Jews, and then later realizing that it also was about Jews, namely because I was looking at abortions in the immediate aftermath of World War II. I ended up writing about Soviet, Red Army sexual violence. At that time, the evidence I had was about women via evidence around abortions and petitions for abortion. So and then actually my second encounter with questions of war and sexual violence also didn't have, in my mind, anything to do directly with the Holocaust, namely because I was working on war and sexual violence. I then started working with people who were trying to resurface the stories of the so-called comfort women in Korea, and the ways in which Japanese memory culture refused to recognize those stories. I mean, by now we've critiqued we have critiqued the very name, of course, comfort women, but at the time it denoted a really very, very important story. So that it was really through this much sort of more global and also comparative framework that I was even able to start to to think about sexual violence in not coming not from the side of the the liberator in case of World War II in Europe, or from perpetrator in the Pacific theater. So which also just I think again then raised for me coming out of this moment of sort of my generation where it was where we were so much thinking about sexuality, sort of the right to be able to be free, to have sex, right? And not to be protected from sex. That it it sort of took actually a long time to be able to hear those stories, and also to I think I'm always on the alert, and that's what, just to finish following up on Pascale, that that I think what's so important about this forum is that it is not in any way reductive, right? I mean that the editors really recognize the complexity of the ways in which sexuality could be a currency of survival. It can involve desire. It can involve maybe even sometimes genuine romance. It can it can come from so many different sources. And how do we and how do we find the language, which we're still in the process of doing, of talking about those experiences without sort of invalidating the ways in which they were actually first talked about. And then I think the last thing that I'm remembering from the forum is that there was a certain irony, I think, for us at the time that we were writing, that sort of just at the moment when we were starting to open up stories that had been taboo,
Yes.
we were at the same time contending with, a certain, new constraints about, being really careful about what triggers. And I think that's also something that we still contend with. I mean, I just did the Holocaust lecture in our survey,
Yes.
and there was a big discussion about, can we show night and fog because it triggers. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. I think we have Björn. Please, Björn, thank you. Thank you for following up on each other's points. Thank you.
I first want to thank Justyna and William for their great contributions. And it's just wonderful to see people with recent PhDs to continue in that field of study after almost 30 years of trying to figure out what this is all about and how to bring it into speech. And of course, as soon as we open a new question like William did, so many more questions immediately appear. Like I wrote down as I was listening to him, like, so was this people or boy relationship to man, this coerced violence, sexual violence, which also was a means of survival for these boys, was this happening in all camps, in some specific camps, in particular types of camps? Other questions, what were the survival rates for these boys? Were any of these men prosecuted legally later or not? Did they ever talk, the violators, the perpetrators themselves about it? What about sexually transmitted diseases? Suddenly, like there's a whole bag of new questions that we may perhaps never find good answers for, but as soon as we step into a new field, new questions arise, and that's the exciting part of it. As maybe some of you know, I've been very much interested in issues of man masculinity, masculine identity, and the Holocaust, both when it comes to all kinds of men, from perpetrators to bystanders to victims. And we always have to work in this ambiguous field of, on the one hand, acknowledging that men have been the subject of historiography for a long time, while at the same time the gender remained invisible. And that's what we try to do, to make the gender visible of men in the Holocaust and World War II. And it always reflects in the titles we give. There's a new book out by Florian Zabransky right now that just came out on Jewish men and the Holocaust and sexuality and intimate histories. And he says it's a balance between agency and vulnerability. Christine Zulk and I will give a Lessons and Legacy seminar next week, and we call it Implicated and Complicit. So it's always keeping this balance between how much power did men have, when did they abuse it, how much non-power did they have, and how did they see themselves as gendered. Lastly, I'm a little worried, given where we are currently globally and now in America, where this field can move, given the new political context that will eventually affect us also at the university level, which is completely opposite to what we have been doing, that we want to do. And I'm seriously worried. So it's really a question that perhaps no one can answer, but really about the future of our studies, the future of our field.
Yes.
And even larger, the future of genocide and Holocaust studies. Dorota, you may know, a center on genocide and human rights studies was just closed at a big university in Montreal. So the places where this happens can even be shut down. And so this is a very open question, but I'm worried about it a lot.
Well, thank you, Björn. Thank you. I wonder, I just realized I don't think Kristin Zulka is here with us. We have Kenny, we have Zoe. I wonder if you'd like to comment, add to those. Zoe, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much to everyone who's already spoken. I endorse all your sentiments. I was thinking about, how much things have changed since I was a research student in the late 1990s working on these things, and also how much things haven't changed. Things have changed less than some might think. I think, I remember being very alarmed by the fact that scholars were really, unwilling to engage in the subject of sexual violence or take gender seriously. And I think that's changed, but it's changed where we focus on certain topics, but not on others. So, I would agree wholeheartedly with this, the discussion at the beginning, and which has been echoed since, about the need to widen our gaze to the diverse range of perpetrators of sexual violence, for example, looking at rescuers, liberators, in-group perpetrators, and so on. I think that's, really important work. But I also think this is something I've been thinking about recently, we need to allow what we already know about to disrupt or challenge what we think we know about the role of sexual violence during the Holocaust more generally. And this is something that I've been back and forth about. But I think, so in other words, I think we need to bring the discussion of gender and sexual violence move it from the periphery into the center. So, because it seems rather diffuse at the moment. So I think, what we need to do is, yes, we need to widen our gaze and think about new subjects and explore new areas, but also use what we already know, as well as developing research to, challenge major narratives about the Holocaust.
Thank you. And as you said, challenge them in the circumstances in which our field of study is finding itself at this current moment, as Björn just said. Yes, thank you.
It still feels that gender and sexual violence is a footnote or an additional chapter or an additional conference rather than the main story. And, for example, I was really struck by what Edward was talking about using our understandings of gender to really, inform our understanding of perpetrator motivation, for example. I think that's really important.
Thank you very much. We are slowly running out of time. I wonder, Kenny, were you jumping in?
Well, I was just thinking, I mean, I come at this from such a different angle from the disability angle. And I was wondering whether sterilization could be thought of as sexual violence. Because amongst disabled people and disabled people during that time, sterilization, I think, was the first thing that happened. When we did this forum, I asked my colleagues here in Germany if there was any research done on sexual violence amongst of disabled people, and they looked at me blankly because the answer was no. And I mean, just from from history and contemporary knowledge, that disabled people are always at great risk for sexual violence. So it must have happened. And of course, because of Action T4, there really were no survivors, who could tell the story afterwards. So I think that's a total place of research that still is just not been done. And I don't even know if it's possible. So.
Thank you. As we have answered some questions, we just are continuously generating new ones. I don't know if whether we have any questions in the Q&A.
Well,
doesn't seem that we do.
Well, we have a comment by Marcy Bloom, who reminds us that at least in the US and in England, it was the 1975 book Against Our Will, Men, Women and Rape by Susan Brownmiller. That was one of the first books to define rape as a social, systematic and political construct and crime rather than an individual act. And I would like to add that, of course, Susan Brownmiller was not the only one in her time, but it is already important for us to note that at the time, she was also relying on discussions that were going on. There were other books there, and also a lot of debates also not only in the women's movement, but also in the civil rights movement. There's now work being done by Lisa Gabriel and others on the history of the knowledge on sexual violence in the the history of knowledge in the Black American women's movement and so on and so on. So this already happened all at that time. So I think we need to, and just to echo what you've already said, we need to really always consider that this is not a new subject, but every generation or every time deals with it in a certain sense. And it is important for us to also look at this history and learn from this, and so that we don't think that we have to reinvent the wheel, but kind of try to figure out what other people already knew, in the sense that Zoe said. We have certain ideas about things, and to catch the nuances. So I think that's very important. But otherwise, in the chat, there are, I think, there's only very positive, I won't read it now, very positive response to the issue as such, to the whole vote.
That is wonderful to hear. I think we have a comment from Ed, and that might be our last one before we wrap up. Ed?
Yeah, I would just like to make 2 quick points. We haven't talked about sexual violence by ethnic auxiliaries, those police auxiliaries, which was widespread, and that deserves its own kind of commentary. The other thing that might be interesting when we speak about sexual violence against Jewish men and Jewish women, especially is to look at the longer term pogrom violence in which that was also accompanied those violence in Eastern Europe, which gets maybe back to some of the ethnic auxiliaries again. A longer tradition of that kind of violence would be interesting to kind of see if there's any continuity and discontinuities we can talk about.
Thank you very much. I think we will pass it over to the journal editors. I just want to quickly say what a pleasure and honor it's been to work with my co-editors. It's been such a meaningful experience in my life for the last 3 years, and thank you all so much from myself, from my heart, truly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Michal Aharony for a few closing remarks, and then a few thank you notes.
So, hello everyone. I would like to thank Dorota and Regina for also a very meaningful and very meaningful experience for me. The last 3 years working with you, it's been a great privilege for me. And I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for all your very hard work and effort. I know it's been challenging, handling all the different aspects of this very difficult issue, which is unfortunately always relevant even today. In the post-October 7th massacre in Israel. So I really want to thank you on behalf of all of us at the journal. And I also want to thank Yoav for managing everything behind the scene. He did a great job, and it was also very challenging. And lastly, I want to thank all the contributors for their excellent articles and inspiring papers. And thank you for organizing, Yoav, and managing this important launch of our special issue. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michal. If I may just join and tell you all, it's been a pleasure to be working with you either as contributors to the forum or of articles. A few people, I guess people don't often realize how rigorous the production process is. And this was a double issue, so let alone double the quantity of articles, but this was such a fascinating and unique special issue to be working with, and it's really been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
One last note, the print issue is coming up by the end of this week. It's already overdue. There have been some delays with our publishers, but the print issue will be available starting this weekend. If you're interested in purchasing a copy, do write me an email. You could just reply to the promotion emails that you've received before, and I will direct you to Taylor and Francis, to the relevant person. Otherwise, I thank you all for coming tonight, and I wish you well.
Thank you.